All right. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm Corey Saylor. I am the Research and Advocacy Director with the Council on American Islamic Relations. CARE just released a new report, Unconstitutional Crackdowns. It's an annual civil rights report that the organization puts out every year. And we're going to have a quick conversation about what's in that report and Islamophobia globally, so we can get some context about where things stand for Muslims, civil rights, and Islamophobia. So let me bring in, first of all, one of the report's co-authors. This is Farah Afifi. She is the Research and Advocacy Manager with CARE, and she will walk you through the key findings of the report. Farah, welcome to the program, and thanks so much. And what'd you find?
Yeah, thank you so much for that introduction, Corey. It's good to be here. As Corey mentioned, my name is Farah Afifi. I am the Research and Advocacy Manager at CARE, and I'm also the co-author of our recent 2025 Civil Rights Report out today, titled Unconstitutional Crackdowns. The first thing I'd like to do is just give us a high-level understanding of some of the core findings of the report. And there are really three core findings to be aware of today. Number one is that we received throughout 2024 8,658 complaints from our offices across the country. This is not only a 7% increase over the previous year, but it is also now the highest number of complaints ever reported to our offices in our organization's 30-year history. While in previous cycles of Islamophobia and anti-Muslim hate, we have seen incidents targeting Muslims and those perceived to be Muslims focused on faith, identity, ethnicity. This year, we know a troubling trend that Muslims are being targeted for holding anti-genocide viewpoints. The second key trend that I think it's important to be aware of is that the most highly reported category to our offices across the country were incidents of employment discrimination. So these is employees being discriminated against by their employer. This is the first time in our reporting history that employment discrimination is the most highly reported category. And I think this speaks to a really troubling trend that we've witnessed from late 2023 throughout 2024, which is that employees, and particularly Muslim, Palestinian, Arab, and other employees sharing anti-genocide viewpoints, are being explicitly targeted not only by peers, not only by those who seek to dox them externally, but by their very employers. And then the final trend that I want to call attention to that's emerging from the report is that we have seen a very troubling and unprecedented increase in the number of law enforcement encounter complaints that have come to our offices. So in 2024, we received 506 complaints of law enforcement encounters. That is a 71.5% increase over the previous year. Now, in April and May 2024, as we all know, we witnessed a number of universities across this country overwhelmingly respond to peaceful student protesters protesting for Palestinian human rights with excessive police force and law enforcement to disperse protesters. We believe we see the direct reflection of those actions in our data in the number of law enforcement encounters that we received. So again, these are the three major trends that we are noting out of this year's report. There is, of course, much more to discuss, and I'm happy to do so, but I'll go ahead and pass it over to you, Corey.
Yeah, that's really appreciated, and thank you for that summary. What we want to do now, we have with us Mobashra Tazamal. She is an associate director at the Bridge Initiative, which is an initiative of Georgetown University. So Mobashra, thanks a lot for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
I'm going to just sort of dive on in. Like, what are your impressions of what Farah just laid out for us?
Firstly, I think that while shocking, it's not surprising. For those of us who've been monitoring, who've been researching, who've been keeping up to date with what's going on, specifically in the US, since Israel's genocide in Gaza, these numbers aren't surprising, but again, shocking. And I think one of the big things I wanted to remind myself while I was reading the report was that this happened under a Democratic administration. This is from 2024. This is not the Trump administration. This is Biden-Harris administration. And so they kind of laid the foundation to where we are headed now with the Trump administration. But when it comes to Islamophobia in 2024, the CARE report reflected also actually what's going on a global scale. So here in the UK, Islamophobia drastically rose last year too. There's an organization here called Tell Mama, which monitors anti-Muslim hate crimes. It recorded, I believe, let me get you the exact numbers. It recorded a little over 6,000 hate cases last year, a 43% increase from 2023. And this is the highest number since the organization started in 2012 that it has recorded. And it documented a further 73% increase in Islamophobic assaults. And so last year, we also had elections here in the UK. Now we have a Labour-led government. Labour is a leftist party, whereas before it was the Conservatives. Under the Conservatives, we also here had, and we still do, pro-Palestine protests on university campuses. And we had mass mobilization, and we still do almost every weekend, actually, in support of Palestine, in support of Palestinian rights. Under the conservative government, they were framed as hate marches. That is the literal term they would use. They would use labeling them as anti-Semitic mobs and so forth. Under the Labour government, the Prime Minister Keir Starmer has changed a bit of his tune since last year, where previously when Israel's genocide had started, he basically signaled that it was perfectly fine for the Israeli government to impose a siege on Gaza. And he himself is an international human rights lawyer, I believe. So there was a big outrage here at that remark coming from the Labour Party, the leftist party. Now in government, I think the Prime Minister and his cabinet do support the ceasefire, but it's unclear exactly. They haven't condemned the actions. There are still protests happening on university campuses. Under the Conservatives, there was also a targeted campaign against journalists. So there were reports of multiple journalists in the UK who law enforcement came into their homes, took their belongings, arrested them. And all of this is under the purview, I think, of quote unquote national security and security threats. And I think that's the language we're seeing in the US now with the Trump administration, framing it as security or, a threat to the foreign policy of the US. But yeah, on a wider global scale, we saw the same things happening in Germany. Massive uptick in Islamophobia, but also anti-Palestinian racism. I think that's very, very important to note. A huge repressive measure being taken by the government in Germany, happening across Europe. So in France and also Australia, Islamophobia has really skyrocketed as well.
So you sort of expanded it out for us already, right? We started with the United States with the data that Farah just gave us, and Mubashir, you talked about the UK, and then a little bit about Europe. I know the Bridge Initiative focuses, though, on the globe, as it were, and you have the Modi government in India. You have what China is doing to its Muslim minority. What does your research suggest is going on? We know that what has happened in the Middle East has driven a wave of Islamophobia, but this seems to be a general upward tick.
Yeah.
Worldwide.
Yeah, I would say that there was a global rightward shift with Trump's initial win in 2016. There was a global rightward shift. You saw a lot of right-wing, far-right parties in Europe coming into power, gaining more popularity, Modi's government, China increasing its repression. And I would say a lot of what has happened is because Islamophobia has been so normalized within society, and that has happened through the terrorism discourse, framing Muslims as a threat, framing Muslims as tied to terrorism, not just Muslims, Islam as well. And that's what China has used, framing Islam as Uyghur Muslims as prone to extremism due to their faith. And in India, it's similar in that they are a threat to the Hindu majority, but also framing them as the other and not loyal citizens. I think this all really, if you want to go back, really did start post 9/11 with the war on terror discourse. And when you have that package and that playbook ready, it can be used by anyone. So we saw that happen in India. Like you said, we've seen it happen in China. We saw it happen in Myanmar with the Rohingya, framing them as terrorists and security threats to the country, to the Buddhist majority as well. That discourse has dehumanized Muslims so much that any action that the state takes is justified, whether that be, locking someone up without any charge or trial, whether that be demolishing their homes, which is a tactic that India adopted literally from Israel's playbook of bulldozing Muslim homes and businesses as a way to threaten them, as a way to, especially if the community has been quite vocal in its political opposition to the government, it's used as a tactic to clamp down on that dissent. But yeah, I would really say that this really started manifesting post 9/11 with a war on terror, and it has slowly amplified. And I think a big portion of that issue has been that Democratic administrations have failed to address this. Under Obama, when he came after the Bush administration, there was hope that there was going to be a kind of a turnaround or a reckoning with what was happening. And instead, he said, yeah, we tortured some people, let's move on. And then we had more covert policies like CVE, which is still rooted in that thought process. And in the UK, we have the equivalent, it's called the PREVENT program. So I would say that really is where it started. And then we've just had a rightward shift, and Islamophobia has been the avenue through which that has occurred.
So I want to bring something over to Farah real quick, but just quickly for viewers who may not be familiar with it, PREVENT, CVE, Countering Violent Extremism. These are programs that are essentially predicated on the idea that Muslims are somehow more inclined to violence, and we have to intervene in their lives in order to make sure that they don't operationalize anything. And there was guidance that was issued that suggested if a guy grows his beard out, that's a sign you have to worry about. But if a guy shaves his beard, that's a sign you have to worry about. So men's fashion, we're really in trouble. We don't know whether to grow our beards, shave them, whatever it is. And then here in the United States, we also saw like soccer leagues for Somali youth. So a soccer league for me when I was a kid was like leadership and having fun. But for a Somali Muslim, like it's somehow terrorism prevention. So that's what Mubashir was talking about there. But Farah, she also mentioned something I thought that was very interesting, and it was the way the narrative is framed allows that these dehumanizing actions toward these disfavored political minorities. And you've done a lot of work on how the narrative has been framed to permit university administrators to target their charges, their students. Why don't you talk a little bit about that for us?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Mubashir, there are so many interesting trends in what you just mentioned at the global level that we could really see here at the local level in the United States as well. But absolutely, I mean, one of the questions that we received earlier today was, to what do you explain this drastic rise in the number of anti-Muslim incidents that we are witnessing across the country, to the number of complaints that have been reported to our offices? And it really comes from, and this is, where I was so interested to hear from you, Mubashira, it really originates with the Biden administration's absolute failure to respond adequately to the Israeli government's assaults on Palestinians in Gaza, particularly in the early days post October 7th and throughout 2024, we witnessed the Biden administration pull on practically every Islamophobic and anti-Palestinian trope that they could have to justify violence against Palestinians in Gaza. And the impact of that on Muslim, Palestinian, and Arab communities in the United States is very palpable, is very well documented in the data that we are receiving. So it is important to remember that this is not an issue that is tied to any particular party, but rather that the United States government and governments across the world as a whole have been promoting this kind of rhetoric to justify human rights violations in the Gaza Strip. And that is exactly also the kind of rhetoric that we see at localized levels by employers, but also at educational institutions, as you were just alluding to, Corey. We have witnessed universities across the country, but I also want to call out that we witnessed universities across the globe, particularly in the UK as well, and I'm sure you can speak to that, Mubashara, who have been demonizing students who are truly advocating for Palestinian human rights. I believe there was a figure coming out of Princeton University, a group at Princeton University that analyzed the protests between October 23 and April/May 2024 that found that 95% of the protests, or something, close to that figure, were peaceful. They were peaceful. There were no incidents of violence at those protests. And yet we have seen university officials, with the support of government officials, with the support of media outlets, craft this narrative that students are acting violently or acting out of hate. And it's really unfortunate, and this is sitting on me, and I wonder if it's sitting on you as well, Mubashara, but I cannot sit here and not be thinking about Mahmoud Khalil, the Columbia University student and activist who was unlawfully detained by ICE just 2 days ago for standing up for Palestinian rights. And so it is this rhetoric that we have seen over the last year and a half that has directly permitted and normalized the government to detain somebody on the basis of protected free speech. And, I want to actually pass it to you, Mubashara, because I hear you talking about what how this particular moment sits in the history of Islamophobia and anti-Muslim racism. But I'd also like to hear what this particular moment, knowing what we know about Mahmoud Khalil's unlawful detainment, what does this say for our moment now and where we're going in the future?
I mean, yeah, I think a lot of us in this space, most of us are thinking about Mahmoud Khalil right now. And I think it's important to note that he was abducted. I think that is the word I would use, because his wife and his lawyer were not given his location, no idea why he was taken. I think we all have seen his conversation. Well, what they relayed is that they said, we're revoking your visa. He's not on a visa. He's a green card holder. He's a lawful permanent resident, married to a U.S. citizen. There's so many implications from this case that we should be very worried about, of what precedent it sets for students who are holding a visa, for other green card holders, even U.S. naturalized citizens. Because if the government can target a green card holder, say we're going to revoke it, what does that mean for naturalized citizens, when we know that Stephen Miller has been working on a policy in the Trump administration to basically go through naturalization applications, whether or not that's 20 years ago, 10 years ago, find some sort of error and then say that was fraud and take away people's citizenships and leave people probably stateless, or whatever you want to call it. That is setting a very, very dangerous precedent. That is giving the executive branch undeterred power. And that is also a big result. This has been able to happen because, again, I'm going to go back to that securitized narrative that has been used against Muslims. So Mahmoud Khalil, the narrative that Trump has been putting out is that he is quote unquote pro-Hamas or Hamas sympathizer, whatever the words are. What we've seen over the past year under Biden administration, now with the Trump administration, the Hamas label is a smear to delegitimize rightful political dissent. It is a smear and a label to drive fear into people. And it is it is the same sort of rhetoric that we heard post 9/11 of you're a terrorist, you're an extremist, you're a fundamentalist, you're a radical, that sort of narrative. And if I just read before we got on that Secretary of State Marco Rubio actually personally signed off on Mahmoud Halil's arrest. And he cited some very vague clause in one of the laws. I can't remember exactly what it was, but he cited that he posed a security threat and a threat to the foreign policy of the U.S. There are no charges. That is a very vague thing of someone poses a threat. What do you mean by that? But do you see how when we talk about securitization and how Muslims are framed as a threat, the very existence of being Muslim or Arab or Palestinian in this moment is viewed by the government as a threat, especially if you are vocal. Especially if you are vocal about the government's actions, especially if you are critical. So I think where we're headed is very dangerous and it is a very scary place. But at the same time, I don't want to scare people. I want to say that there is a mass response from organizations. There's mass response from CARE. There are local organizations, there are multi-faith organizations. We're seeing a response of, organizing power, but that it is important to be mindful of the administration that we are, as Americans, that we are currently functioning under, and to know that tomorrow there could be something completely chaotic again. And I think that's the point of this administration, is complete chaos and constant like decisions that make everyone stop and go like, what is going on? And I think that's the point.
Yeah, I feel like I've stopped and gone, what is going on a lot lately.
Yeah.
But both of you have sort of hinted at something that I want to put, and this is to both of you. Who benefits, right? We've been talking about narratives and, signing off on labeling, what under McCarthyism, they would have been called communists. Today, they're called anti-American or other things, because that's the term of art today to describe your politically disfavored enemies. But who's benefiting from this? What does your research tell each of you?
Farah, do you want to go? I'm happy to go.
Yeah, I can start maybe at one point and then we can converge. But I think, immediately when it comes to mind in the theme of, speaking about the students and the student protests that we've been seeing, I think that universities, from what I can tell, are really failing to respond, partially because of their endowments. And many of their endowments have financial ties potentially to weapons manufacturing. And those weapons manufacturers might potentially be involved in the Israeli government's assault on Palestinians. So I think that there appears to be some form of incentive for universities to continue with the norm, to continue to move forward and potentially benefit from weapons manufacturing profits. And so I think that when they are met with students who are attempting to stand on principle and say that when we say human rights, it means human rights for all, and when we say justice, it means justice for all, I think that is leading to potentially a lot of universities failing to have those really critical conversations with students. I mean, I think one thing that is interesting, I won't necessarily say shocking, but interesting to me, is that you have a group of students across the country. We know that they are, for the vast majority, peaceful protesters who have not engaged in violence, and the universities are unwilling to even give them a discussion, a conversation, an open meeting. In many incidents, students are asking to meet with their administrators, and their administrators are calling police on a group of 18 to 22-year-olds. And I think when we're speaking about the university example in particular, that example comes to mind, but I'm going to pass it over to you, Mubashir, because I'd be interested to hear from you as well, from a global perspective, of what you think is going on.
Yeah, so I think there's two sides to this. So one side, Islamophobia is very lucrative. It is a very lucrative industry. There are individuals and there are entire media platforms, entire media channels that thrive off putting anti-Muslim narratives out there, and it sells. It sells, unfortunately. It has sold for at least the last 25 years. And so there's a lot of money, and there's a lot of money to be made by dehumanizing Muslims, unfortunately. The other side to that is that it is central to empire. It is central to the American empire. It is central to the American support and financing of Israel. And I think that within the US, Islamophobia has long been there before 9/11. It's a part of racism that the US has never really reckoned with. So there are benefits in terms of it is lucrative, but I do believe that there are people in power, in positions of power, who firmly hold anti-Muslim views and beliefs. And that's the other aspect, is that the people in power also use Islamophobia as a scapegoat to avoid real issues. So Islamophobia is used in the context of Gaza to avoid talking about a genocide and recognizing a genocide is happening, and instead frame Palestinians as terrorists. And we've seen that play out for the past at least 25 years constantly when it comes to vulnerable Muslim communities around the globe, of constantly framing them as a threat when they're the ones being targeted. And a lot of it comes from top down. It comes from the state. It comes from the media. It comes from those in power. So yeah, it's lucrative. It's central to empire building, and it's a great way to take attention away from real issues.
All right. I have just two questions left for us as we sort of start toward wrapping up. I think this happens to anybody involved in research, that at some point in time you go, "Oh, I didn't expect to see that." So what Farah, in your work on this civil rights report, Mubashara, your work generally, what kind of struck you as unexpected that you think not enough people know about and that people watching this conversation should be aware of?
I have to say, Corey, I think that late 2023, our release of the Civil Rights Report last year, which had found similarly troubling trends in the increase of Islamophobia and the increase in the number of complaints we received, have primed me not to think that much of what we're releasing today is unexpected or shocking. I think that what we are seeing this year is the continuation of a trend that we had noted last year, and also very explicitly a signal as a failure of our government to adequately address Islamophobia and anti-Palestinian racism. I think one thing that struck me as unprecedented, though not necessarily shocking, was the increase in law enforcement encounters that we witnessed, as well as the increase in employment discrimination complaints. So I mentioned at the top that the number of employment discrimination complaints we received in this last year is not only the highest number that we had received, but also was unprecedented in the sense that employment discrimination had never topped the number of complaints that we had received. In the past, immigration and asylum cases had always been, or pretty closely had always been, at the top of the number of complaints we receive. And that was because, as our care offices frequently deal with immigration and asylum issues. I think what was shocking was that the number of employment discrimination cases had increased, but also that they had surpassed even education-related complaints. So even as we sit here and say the situation on campuses is extremely difficult, the situation on our university campuses is unprecedented, is akin to some of the worst moments in history that we have seen, employment discrimination was still higher. And I think that what that speaks to is what might be a crisis that is boiling under the surface, though I suspect will become a bigger and bigger part of American life, which is that employees, particularly Muslim, Palestinian, and Arab employees, are being targeted, particularly for having viewpoints that are otherwise welcome in the workplace. I think you mentioned this at the press conference earlier, Corey, but we are working on an employment campaign and an employment report. And one of the things that I found most interesting about the data that I'm looking at is that employers who had been nominally committed to inclusive work cultures that had been saying, we welcome political speech at work. We welcome you to share your opinions. We welcome you to share identity-related speech, whether that had to do with Black Lives Matter, whether that had to do with LGBTQ issues, are now saying this is where we draw the line. If you are Muslim, Palestinian, Arab, or if you are an employee who is sharing something in support of Palestinian rights, we frequently see employers saying that that is a red line, and they have been either disciplining employees, terminating them outright. And so I think what really, if I were to say that there was one thing that felt unprecedented emerging from this report, and that felt shocking given what we know to be true and given what we've seen to be true, is that employment is a crisis that is boiling under the surface, and that I suspect will become a bigger issue, not only for Muslim, Palestinian, and Arab employees, but other employees as well, because I think we all know this to be true. But when rights are being, gradually retracted from a minoritized people, it will affect others. It is a signal for what is to come for others who would like to share speech or who would like to share identity-related speech related to other topics that might become controversial or maybe that everyone doesn't agree on.
Yeah, not great. Basha?
Yeah, I just wanted to add one thing after what Farah had mentioned about how other communities, these actions can target other communities. And I think a great example of that, just to add on, is Guantanamo. Guantanamo, originally the military prison opened to house Muslim men and boys who had been kidnapped in Afghanistan, sold by the Pakistani government, accused of being terrorists, most never charged, never tried. And for the past 22 years, activist organizations have said shut Guantanamo down because it will be used by another administration to target another community. And what have we had this year? We've had the Trump administration take undocumented migrants and put them in Guantanamo, where there are reports that they are facing, really cruel treatment. And so that is just an example to show that, yes, the actions and the repression targeting Muslim, Arab, Palestinian communities, once you allow that to happen, that sort of sets a precedent again that it can be used for other communities. And I think that is something that I would really like people to be aware of. But in terms of something, I think in the last year that really I would say shocked by, and I don't know if that's by me being optimistic, but the way the media has reported, and I'm talking about Western media, both leftist and right and centrist and moderate, whatever, has reported on the genocide in Gaza has made me really think about what media I trust and what are journalistic ethics and guidelines when you're framing a genocide, when there's literal headlines saying, every time they were trying to discredit the death count in Gaza, they would say, the Hamas run Gaza ministry, blah, 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 as a way to delegitimize the numbers. I mean, President Biden himself tried to delegitimize the numbers. But when it comes to these headlines, and the reason why I get really, I think I'm almost just like, I don't have the words to describe how horrible it is, because I think, Farah, we were talking about it, you feel like it's like a global gaslighting. The reality that you're seeing, but the narratives that you're reading are completely ignoring that. I will say, social media has definitely been central into helping us see and what's happening on the ground in Gaza, from journalists in Gaza, from Palestinian journalists. But when it comes to, the Washington Post, the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Guardian, I read these every day as a way to monitor Islamophobia, and just the level of just lack of journalistic ethics and morals and guidelines and protocols and regulations when it comes to this issue is shocking. And it's not just, like I said, it's not just right-leaning, media platforms. It's the New York Times, and they have been one of the worst ones when it comes to reporting on the genocide. So I think that was something that in the past year has really struck out to me, and I think that's going to impact people's trust in news, in fact, in where they're getting their reporting from. I think it's especially in the Trump era that we live in, where everything, people call it post-truth, which I don't know what that is, but I think it creates a very dangerous environment because you don't know who to trust and you don't know what to trust. And if you don't have that, where do we go from that? But yeah, I think that was a big, big issue for me.
That actually leads to my last question for this conversation.
Yeah.
Where do you go? So, we all have a lot of ideas, and it's always important to remember that civil society groups and advocacy organizations are not without power, right? Women have the vote in the United States today because people stood up and spoke out. Children aren't sent to work every day in the United States because people stood up and spoke out. We divested from white supremacists, South African apartheid, because students stood up and spoke out. And it wasn't easy, but they did that. So for each of you, in your research, what solutions have you seen being implemented that you wish you could call the leaders of civil society organizations and be like, you need to do more of this?
I think for me, it goes back to students and universities, because I do believe that to an extent it is at the core of the multiple issues that we're seeing converging today. And I think that what I want to call attention to is the way that we have seen students transgress and overcome any boundaries or any lines in terms of faith, race, ethnicity, to build what is a very diverse coalition of students who are calling for justice and human rights and centering Palestinian lives. If you go to any university campus, it is not just Muslim, Palestinian, Arab students who are being directly impacted by this, who are the ones who are leading protests, the ones who are leading peaceful sit-ins. It's a really diverse coalition of Muslims, Palestinians, Arabs, African-American students, Jewish students, Christian students. And so I think what is important for us to take as a lesson from those incidents is how to work cross coalitions, cross issues, to ensure that we are supporting each other at this time. I mean, to go back to what we were speaking about earlier, Mubashara, the arrest and detainment of Mahmoud Khalil is just the beginning, really, of what we could see happen, not just to Muslims, Palestinians, and Arabs, but to anybody who is sharing political speech, not just about Palestine, but any issue. And this administration is very clearly showing us that if you are going to say something that it does not like, it could get to you. It could send ICE after you potentially. And so I think that what this moment calls for, as it has always called for throughout history, is cross-coalitional efforts of individuals from various faiths, ethnicities, religious backgrounds, etc., coming together and standing up for one another. And I think that's what gives me hope, is the knowledge that there are people on the ground. We know our students are doing this work. We can see the immediate response that many organizations have been putting into action following the detainment of Mahmoud Khalil. And I think that seeing more of that in every sector, at the university, at the employee level, at various levels, is exactly what we need to see in order to ensure that everyone's civil rights, civil liberties, and human rights are being respected at what appears to be such a difficult time, not just in the United States, but across the world.
All right. Final word, Mubashara.
I completely agree with everything Farah is saying. And also, I think specifically in terms of university campuses, I think faculty need to also be at the forefront, especially tenured faculty. I think if you have the power and the security, then you should be out there defending your students and protecting them, because university environments are all about, what do you learn in a university environment? You learn about, history, you learn about activism, and campus environment is very much so an activist environment. These students are doing exactly what you're learning about in the classroom. They're speaking against tyranny. They're calling attention to a genocide. They're calling for the protection of the rights of Palestinians who have been denied their rights for decades. So I think from a university aspect, I think faculty really should be doing more. But from a global, a regional, a national, again, I'm going to go with what Farah says. I think I look back to 2017, 2018, 2019, that era when the original Muslim ban happened, and the response of grassroots organizations in the US, not just Muslim or Arab, immigrant rights, everyone, all of these organizations came together to push back against this. And I think I look to that as a success because I saw how people came together. I was in the country, I was in DC at the time, and I just saw how much support there was, and how different organizations were taking the time to to fight against this policy. So I think today, I think we need more of those coalitions. And I think we have a younger generation as well today who are very super activists. We have a very, a generation coming out of university that are I think a lot better organized than we were post university. I think they are a lot more knowledgeable about what the issues are. And aside from that, I also think just investing in legal and advocacy work is so important. Look, after the Muslim ban, we all turned to lawyers and attorneys to help us figure out what's going on. Now, what are we seeing? We're seeing lawsuits. We're seeing, lawsuits against the administration, and going into the judicial realm is a way to protect future communities, to protect ourselves in the future as well. So that's why I think legal and rights advocacy work is so important. And I think that is definitely where a lot of effort should be put into as well, because we saw the effectiveness of it with the Muslim ban, of constant, going back and forth. I know it's a lot of work and I know it takes a long time, but I do think it's very effective. And then I also think it's important to control our own narrative. I think it's very important to not be on the defense. I think we learned that over the years, is that we need to call out what this is and name it and call it out and not be defensive. We know these are smears. We know these are Islamophobic tropes that are constantly being used. As soon as we are vocal about what our government is doing when it comes to genocide abroad. So yeah, I think as a community, own our narrative and build coalitions and invest in legal and advocacy work. Yeah.
Outstanding. So look, those are the opinions of two subject matter experts who look at Islamophobia every day, all day, as their job and their own personal passions for research and learning more and solving problems. Farah Afifi, thank you so much for joining us. Unconstitutional Crackdowns, if you want to get a copy of it, you can go to islamophobia.org and download it from there. Mubashara Tazmal, thank you also so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Bridge.georgetown.edu is where you can find her work and her research. So thank you, everyone, for giving us some time out of your day. Thank you, Farah Mubashara, for the conversation. And we look forward to seeing everyone in the future. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.